Okay, well, we are going to go ahead and get started here today. So I want to welcome everyone to this session. Hopefully you're in the right place. This topic is English learners finding common ground and where we need to keep working. And my name is Kelly Stuart. I'm the president and CEO of Collaborative Classroom. We're happy to be a co-sponsor of this event today. And I'm really happy to be joined by three experts in the field that I think are going to have a wonderful discussion for our participants today. So I'm going to, the way this session is going to work, we're going to let each of them kind of talk for the first 5 minutes each. And as they're talking, I just have you introduce yourselves, Claude, Martha, and Jim. You can highlight the things that you want highlighted here. So we'll do that. And so I want to just let people know we're joined by Claude Goldenberg today from Stanford University, Martha Hernandez from Californians Together, and Jim Cummins from the University of Toronto. And this discussion is really focused on conversations involving advocates for English learners and supporters of the science of reading to find common ground in order to move towards more productive literacy practices here in our state. So this session is going to feature our three participants talking about their perspectives on where we already have common ground, where some disagreements exist, and how we move forward. So that's kind of the setup for our conversation today. So without further ado, Claude, I'm going to let you kick us off, and each of you are going to have 5 minutes. So I'm going to try to hold you to the 5 minutes so that we can pull out the most salient points through here today. I am going to pin each of you, so you'll get kind of big, so don't be startled. But I'll let you kick us off, Claude.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks very much. And thanks to Martha and Jim. I'm going to get right to my comments. I mean, you already know more than you need to know about me. It doesn't really matter. I really want to get into this conversation because it's something that we all think is very important. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with the three of you. So I think there are really considerable areas of agreement, and there are more, but I'm going to spotlight three of them. One is the importance of early literacy experiences before children even start school. You know, in interactions I've had with Jim over the past few months, he's emphasized literacy socialization and literacy saturation in the preschool years and beyond. And we both lamented the fact that it tends to get overlooked because we're also focused on what happens in classrooms, in kindergarten and beyond. And Jim, I got to tell you, by the way, you've gained a new fan in my wife, a former Head Start teacher. And when she looks at me and I'm telling her about these conversations, I can tell she's thinking, why can't you be more like Jim? Okay, duly noted. But the point is, I think we can all agree on this point. Marilyn Adams wrote about it in her 1990 classic. So did neuroscientist Mark Seidenberg in his more recent classic. Reed Lyon, the father reading first, told Congress about this 25 years ago in his testimony. And one of the readings I've suggested for this session that I think you all will have access to is about the preschool period. So I don't think there's any daylight between us on the importance of literacy socialization, literacy saturation. The other thing we agree on is that literacy involves much more than foundational skills. Foundational skills instruction, phonological awareness, letter sound associations. You heard it from Kareem, so I don't need to recite the litany. Those are essential to help children connect the sounds of spoken speech to their written representations. Martha has shared as her recommended reading the comprehensive literacy approach for ELs that the National Committee on Effective Literacy presented at a recent webinar sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education. And it also identifies foundational skills that we all agree on and the importance of students being able to hear the sounds in words and the need for systematic instruction in phonics and decoding and other basic reading mechanics. Those are the terms that the document uses, basic reading mechanics. But we also all agree that language, comprehension, vocabulary, background knowledge, among other things, are all very, very essential. The third thing we all agree on is that bilingual approaches are preferable, assuming, of course, adequate infrastructure and expertise. And we also agree that the best sort of bilingual education is long-term and strives for bilingualism and biliteracy, and for English speakers, not just for English learners. And then for students in English medium instruction, which is by far the majority of our English learners, English oral language support and instruction must be provided to support literacy acquisition and of course, ongoing language development, both of which are absolutely essential. So for the areas of disagreement, I have fewer, only two, right? So we have more agreement than disagreement. Just note the higher mathematics involved here. So for the two areas of disagreement, I'm going to highlight two. First of all, how much priority should be assigned to foundational skills instruction? Now, these are the skills that are needed to understand that by paying close attention to the letters that are in written words, and the place of those letters in the words, you're able to say a recognizable word, or at least a close approximation to it. This is, usually called phonics or decoding. It's actually more complicated. But one of the reasons there's disagreement, I think, among us is that it's really nearly impossible to put a particular timestamp on how long, how much, for how many years students need foundational skills instruction. I mean, for some students, you need some each day to teach reading, at least in the beginning stages. How much? 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 45 minutes. Regardless, the key thing is the beginning readers need foundational skills instruction until they get enough traction to lift off, my favorite metaphor at the moment, till they achieve lift off. That is to say, when they get the idea of what reading involves, know enough of the rules, and they begin to make progress on their own without a lot or maybe even any systematic or direct instruction. How much systematic and direct foundational skills instruction do they need? Well, there are different perspectives, and we don't really have agreement on that. We may never have agreement on that because there's so many kids who need different amounts of instruction. The second area of disagreement, and I just came out of a really interesting session on identifying kids at risk, but the other area of disagreement is identifying children who might have particular difficulty in learning to read. The fact is that learning to read is very or even exceedingly difficult for some children, regardless of the language they're learning to read in. Even if they come, and some of these kids even come from literacy-saturated homes. Now, the good news is that researchers have developed screening instruments that can help identify these children. The other good news is that if we provide appropriate early instruction and follow-up as needed, the likelihood that students will develop a reading disability actually goes down. And this is true with English speakers and with English learners. It's true with both groups of students, with all groups of students. And it's been demonstrated in Brownsville, Texas, one of the poorest districts in the country, with many, many English learners. Brownsville schools have cut down by 75% the number of special education's teachers they need. Now, not everyone agrees with the wisdom of early screening and then working to try and ward off reading difficulties. Many of my colleagues in the EL community have reservations because there have been serious misuses and abuses of this practice where children have been inappropriately labeled learning disabled. This is an important consideration. It's a very, very important factor and explains to a large degree why there's some opposition among many EL advocates to having universal early screening. But I think we need to use the tools that we have, at the same time, erect guardrails to prevent misuse. We have tools that are adequate. Can they get better? Of course, and more online, more are being developed, but we need to keep working on this.
Okay, thank you so much, Claude. Jim, I'm going to have you step in next and just kind of share your perspective of where you see common ground and where you still see some disagreements.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. And let me express my appreciation to Claude and his wife for being so articulate in terms of highlighting the areas of agreement that we have. I basically want to make 2 points that I think have been neglected in the discussions to this point about the science of reading, and particularly in journalistic accounts of this movement. The first point concerns English learners or emergent bilingual students. And that's the fact that there's a huge amount of research showing strong relationships between the extent to which students' home language gets developed and the extent to which they succeed in English literacy skills. And so that gets taken care of in dual language programs. But as Claude pointed out, most English learners are not in dual language programs, they're in English medium programs. And we tend to assume that, okay, it's an English medium program, The teacher may not speak the student's home language. So therefore the first language is not something that I need to be concerned about as a teacher. I think that's a huge mistake, because the more we can work with parents to alert them to what they can do to help their children learn how to read and succeed academically, the better. And so in talking with parents, we need to highlight the fact that they should keep speaking their home language to their children. They should expose children to as much storytelling, book reading in that language, or in English if they're fluent in English, because the more the home language gets developed in the home as well as in the school, the better students are going to do in reading. There's a lot of research pointing in that direction. So in mainstream, so-called mainstream English medium classes, we need to pay attention to the home language. And one website that I think would be really interesting for a lot of people to look at is the Language Friendly Schools website. This is a movement that started in Europe a couple of years ago. And if you go to languagefriendlyschool.org, you'll find all kinds of ideas and examples of schools that are English medium or monolingual in their instruction, but have brought in and welcomed students' home languages into the school context. And this makes a huge difference in terms of students' attitudes towards their home language, their sense of themselves as bilinguals or multilinguals. And so there's a lot we can do in mainstream English medium programs to promote biliteracy among students. So that's one point. The second point concerns what I think is left out of the science of reading. A science of reading should include all of the science. And obviously, as Claude has pointed out, that many of the researchers and academics involved with the science of reading are very much aware of the fact that we need to do much more than just teach phonics effectively. But in journalistic articles, we constantly see in the opening paragraph an opposition made between the science of reading and balanced literacy. And I want to reclaim the notion of balanced reading or balanced literacy, because what I mean by it is exactly what Claude discussed earlier on. The extent to which we include teaching decoding skills together with literacy saturation, immersion of children in a rich literacy environment from the earliest possible stage, the better students are going to do. There's a huge amount of research out there showing strong relationships, causal relationships between literacy engagement and reading comprehension. And this is something that doesn't get emphasized nearly enough within the discourse of the science of reading. So when we look at differences between low-income students and higher-income students in terms of success in school generally and literacy in particular, one of the reasons for that is that in many cases, there's about a 4-year difference, a 4-year gap in literacy socialization between rich kids and poor kids. Poor kids, poor families don't have money to buy books. Parents may not be highly educated themselves. They don't realize that reading is important. Kids from more affluent backgrounds are being immersed in a rich literacy environment from the time they're toddlers. One of the things that we need to do in our preschool programs and in the early grades is to complement the teaching of foundational skills with immersion of children in a rich literacy environment so that they build up an affective connection to books and to reading in addition to just learning skills.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, Martha, bring us home on your 5 minutes of common ground and disagreements.
Thank you. And I'm Martha Hernandez. I'm the Executive Director of Californians Together and a member of the National Committee for Effective Literacy. And I'm going to, echo my two colleagues. I mean, a huge step, of course, is that there has been quite a bit of engagement between English learner, experts and advocates and the supporters of the science of reading, and much ground has been covered. And as both Jim and Claude have, stated, there is a vast amount of agreement. important. And yes, we both agree that foundational skills are critical for all students and critical for English learners, and they need to be explicitly taught. But I think that we all agree that they should not be the sole cornerstone of literacy instruction in the early years. I think we agree, as Claude mentioned, that literacy is multidimensional, includes reading and writing and a host of other components, and is built upon a foundation of language. And again, as Jim has mentioned, students arrive to school with a diverse range of language and literacy experiences, and so instruction must be flexible to meet the diverse needs of students. And also, I think we all agree, and I need to state, that oral language is critical. And of course, early experiences, of course. And so one of the areas where we need more dialogue and discussion is really, I think, in the implementation of the science of reading, and also what is meant by a comprehensive, multidimensional approach to literacy. And so one issue comes down, of course, to dosage, duration, and what is meant by the primacy of foundational skills. And Claude brought this up. Does it mean that you teach foundational skills first until mastered before addressing the other essential components of literacy? Does it mean that you focus large amounts of the literacy block on those skills? Does it mean that your professional learning solely focuses on the foundational skills? Or does it just mean that they need to be addressed, of course, in early literacy? When those in the field hear the word primacy, it gives the impression that it is the most important component, so more time needs to be dedicated to it. And as you know, we, of course, advocate for a comprehensive, multidimensional approach and feel that there must be time in the language arts block and throughout the school day to address skills such as oral language, vocabulary, developing background knowledge, listening, syntax, writing, and reading comprehension, both in English and in the student's home language when possible. And of course, there needs to be time to make those cross-language connections. And as Jim, mentions, and, he's such an advocate for, print access and active engagement with text. This is a comprehensive approach to literacy. And in this approach, all of the components are important. Each supports the others. No component alone constitutes a reasonable reading or literacy approach. No element has primacy or priority over another, and no element alone or in isolation is sufficient. To quote Tim Shanahan, it would be cruel to put all the emphasis on one part of the process while allowing kids to languish with the other parts. Altogether, it's the integration of all of the elements and the responsiveness of instruction to student needs that really adds up to effectiveness for English learners, and I would say for all learners. I think it's important not to wait until they've learned to decode and to also work on the other components. It isn't sequential. It's not that once these foundational reading skills are in place, then students can comprehend and think critically about text. They should be worked on simultaneously and support each other. And I do want to say that we also advocate for the provision of high-quality English language development. ELD is an essential partner to literacy instruction, and of course, all students need access to the full curriculum. And so this begs again the question about the allotment of time, and we've kind of, this is kind of a difficult, but I think that the English learner community of literacy and language experts and advocates are clear that that only 25% of the language literacy block be dedicated to foundational skills and their application in kinder and first grade. And I'm talking about, the foundational skills of, phonemic awareness, letter formation, letter sound association, of course, phonics, decoding, encoding, and fluency in these skills. But by dedicating 25% to foundational skills, kids get what research says is an effective dose of phonics instruction, and they don't miss out on all of the other things that they need if they are to become good readers. And I just want to say one more thing, and it's all about the bilingual brain. The new language for an English learner and the literacy system is developed in the presence and interaction with an existing language system that calls for a different pedagogy. Language processing in the bilingual mind differs from the monolingual mind. And I'm talking both for those who are in a dual language biliteracy context and those who are in an English medium context. The development of literacy for a dual language brain is not the same as for a monolingual brain. And I'll leave it there at this time.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to add all of you to the spotlight here. Jim and excellent. Great. So I'm just going to lift up a couple things that I heard, and we'll have a little bit of dialogue about those. But it sounds like there's actually a lot of agreement between the three of you in a lot of the areas. It seems like one of the things I'm hearing in this particular session is there's some question around what gets primacy, how much time gets allotted to certain skills that we're trying to develop. So did I get that right? Or is there something else that you feel like is something that's a big disagreement between the three of you?
I think you got it right. I mean, it's like the details matter, because it sort of in a big holistic picture, I think there's not much daylight here. But you're right, picking up the primacy. Do some things matter more at certain stages than others? I mean, there is a developmental sequence in becoming literate, which, I didn't get into. But if you really want to dive into it, you got to look at the developmental sequence and take a look at what gets primacy. And I mean, I use that word unapologetically, what gets primacy at different stages. Now, primacy doesn't mean exclusivity, right? You can't confound those two. I mean, I see those foundational skills as necessary, but not sufficient. Kind of like the foundation for a building is necessary, but I wouldn't want to live in a foundation alone. But without a good foundation, the building's going to collapse.
Absolutely. Jim, or anything?
I think we agree, building, strong foundational reading skills is important, but not sufficient for students' overall reading and literacy development. So I agree.
I think it's worth going back to the National Reading Panel and just reminding people of one of its findings. They found that there was no relationship after grade 1 between what they call systematic phonics instruction and reading comprehension for normally achieving and low achieving students. There was a continuing relationship for students who were classified as reading disabled. So what the National Reading Panel found was that in the big picture, phonics instruction rapidly reaches a point of diminishing returns after grade 1. Now, we've got to take that in the context of the need to differentiate instruction. And so when we look at the challenge for teachers, it's the challenge of having students who may be at very different stages in their growth in reading in the same class. And so we need to have teachers who are not just reading a one-size-fits-all script, but who are differentiating their instruction to what students need. And some students will need phonics instruction for much longer than grade 1. Others may be self-teaching during grade 1 and not need intensive phonics at that level. So we need to take account of that differentiation.
There's another point of agreement. I mean, really, I do think the one-size-fits-all mantra is just, it's a canard. It's a red herring, because anyone who really knows the research would just completely dismiss that as nonsensical. And it's exactly what Jim says. I mean, the kids who need continued instruction and foundational skills need continued instruction and foundational skills. And we actually have research from Carol Connor showing that kids who are strong in foundational skills, but actually need some work on language and comprehension, if you keep beavering away at foundational skills, you set back their reading progress. So you don't want to provide foundational skills instruction. You want to look for the term that I used was liftoff, because we do have some evidence that there's self-teaching, there's computational learning, all sort of technical things I don't fully understand. So I understand it as liftoff. Once kids get traction because they understand the rules, the whole idea, then you can really definitely ease off. And no one that I know would argue for doing foundational skills instruction when kids can already decode and read at a certain level, and it becomes a complete waste of time.
I do want to say also that, for students who are in a dual language immersion program and learning foundational skills in their home language, and some of those languages are more transparent than English, that we really need to make sure we have a scope and a sequence so that we don't waste their time with sounds that they already know when they begin to read in English. And I see that a lot of times in the field, when they start English reading, they start from the beginning. They just kind of start from the beginning of whatever program they're doing without consideration for this scope and sequence across languages. So
it's an excellent
that is a very good point. I would want to distinguish here between whatever you call it, science of reading, reading research. I hate how science reading has become kind of a lightning rod. I think of it as reading research, comprehensively defined, as I think Jim is suggesting. And anyone who knows reading research knows about the concept of transfer. And you want to transfer from previous knowledge to current and applicable transfer. So we want to really distinguish between the application that we see in classrooms, which is not exactly informed consistently or even inconsistently by the best research we have, in contrast to the knowledge base that has, I think, more solidity to it than maybe some people acknowledge.
Absolutely. Great. So we're going to kind of shift a little bit. I see a few questions coming in that I'll certainly get to. But because the three of you have been involved in these discussions, and it sounds like there is a ton of alignment with the three of you. But in terms of kind of informing the field, do you feel like meaningful progress has been made in your discussions? Kind of, where do we go from here? How do districts think about this work? Any resources that you want to make sure folks know about as well?
If I can just jump in there, I think certainly amongst the three of us, I think the alignment has grown much closer than we might have thought at the beginning of our discussions a few months ago. But when we look at what's happening or what's not happening in districts, I still see so little mention of the notion of reading engagement or literacy engagement in any discussion of science of reading. If we look at only one side of the coin, we don't get the full picture. We need to turn that coin around and acknowledge the research that's out there showing strong causal relationships between print access, print exposure, and literacy engagement, and how well children learn how to read. And the research is just as powerful, if not more so, than any of the research showing relationships between phonics instruction and learning to read. And so for me, it's a both and, which is what I mean by balanced literacy. And if we neglect one or the other, students are going to lose out. And so a student who comes from a home background, a family background where there's been a lot of exposure to print is in a much better situation to get a lot out of phonics instruction or foundational skills instruction in kindergarten and grade 1 than a child that's coming in with minimal exposure to print. And so we need to focus in particular on the preschool stage. We need to focus on Head Start programs that serve low-income students because I suspect that there's probably minimal knowledge of the research showing that there are long-term positive gains that students get if they're in a preschool environment that is print saturated. People need to know about that research and implement it.
So Kelly, if I can just jump in, I don't disagree at all with what Jim said, but here's the question. Not all kids come with that. And what do you do with them? Send them back to preschool, send them back to their home so they can relive ages 0 to 5? No, obviously not. We have lots of kids who come to school who are really very dependent on the school to provide the kind of instruction, experience, and yes, screening that's necessary to make sure that everyone gets on track with literacy. There's nothing to disagree with about what Jim says, but it's just limited because not all kids have those experiences. So we got to be ready and prepared, willing and able to provide the kind of instruction, the kind of assessment, the kind of intervention that's needed to make sure kids learn to read regardless of the home background. We should continue striving for enriched home backgrounds or programs that pediatricians have initiated, right? Reach out and read, giving parents books, and that's great. I totally support that. But some kids are going to come to school without those experiences. What are you going to do for them?
Kelly, if I can just jump in very quickly to respond to Claude, what you do is from the day the student walks into kindergarten, you immerse that child in a rich literacy environment where they're listening to stories being read. They're gaining a sense of what print is all about. They're gaining an affective connection to story. You can even begin to teach comprehension strategies at that stage. This teacher's reading a story to the child and ask students to stop, or we stop for a second and ask the students, what do you think is going to happen next? We're teaching the reading strategy of prediction long before students started to decode. At the same time, we're building up concepts of print, and we're beginning teaching foundational skills. So it's a both and a simultaneous approach where both are equally important. And the kind of unease that I have with, I guess, Claude's use of the term primacy of foundational skills is that I don't see it as being helpful to say one is more important or imply that one is more important than the other. We do both. And the more students are immersed in literacy, the easier it's going to be for them to gain access to phonics and other foundational skills.
Martha, do you want to jump in on this?
Yes, I do. So I think that progress has been made in terms of our dialogue and discussion, and, we are continuing to engage. And it's time to take action. And I think that Claude kind of is modeling it. I mean, I think we need to make a commitment to echo our common ground. And I think we need to push back when the media tries to incite the notion of a war. It is not a war. And just as Jim said, it is not either or, but it's both and. And we need to ensure through our writing, our presentations, our workshops, and our professional learning that we stress that all components of literacy are necessary. Maybe it's a communications issue, but we need to make sure that everyone knows that foundational skills are not the only important component. So we need to collectively be a voice for all of the components and the interaction and integration of those elements. And so, English learners, and I think all students, are in jeopardy of not developing literacy if any of those elements are ignored and missing. And so I think we need to provide guidance about all of these issues, dosage, duration, differentiation, the need to have this comprehensive model of literacy. And I have a question too, if we do shore up foundational skills, will it be sufficient to close gaps? No. Is the problem really slowly the lack of teaching foundational skills?
No.
I think that there are other issues we need to address, and we need to be in united force to avoid the narrowing of language and literacy to a few reading skills, and that we need to make sure that we don't replace ELD and make it, more of another reading block. And just acknowledgement that an equity-based, English learner-centric perspective has to address issues of educational access and equity for second language learners in an unequal social, political context. And also that the vision of literacy really includes biliteracy. And I think that Claude spoke to that. But, the process of literacy development for English learners must be assets-based, not deficit-based. And we need to build on the skills and proficiencies that leverage their strengths. And we need to embrace their dual language and dual cultural realities. And this involves, as Jim said, basing the literacy approach on research that is about English learners, that's about second language development and instruction, that's about the dual language brain and bilingualism and social cultural factors, and not on research that does not include an explicit focus on these students. And so the degree to which we frame the issue of literacy development and approach literacy instruction and recognition of these factors, I think is, a central concern as we seek common ground.
Thank you for that. Claude, I'm going to let you jump in here a little bit. I know in a lot of conversations I'm in around this, I don't know that anyone's just only pushing for phonics and phonics first. So it does sound like there's a communication challenge, there's a dosage challenge, there's kind of what does this look like in a classroom challenge that we right. need to get after. And just want to see what any of you want to add to that.
No, I think you summarized it quite well, Kelly. I mean, we just don't have the time we're out of time actually, except for whatever additional time you're going to add on and protect for us. But we don't have a time to get into the really important nitty-gritty details. I mean, I've been involved in some conversations where we've tried to do exactly that. I think it's very important to do that. I mean, I think it's also very important to clarify the terrain, which is, I think, what the purpose here is, so people can judge for themselves where there's agreement and where there's some points that we need more dialogue, more communication. The other thing I think we need, and I'm just going to go into some of what we might get into, is there are a couple of things I worry about going forward, because I know we need to wrap this up. The things, I worry about a lot of things, and I'd have to pay a therapist to really deal with everything. But the two things I worry about most in this space is that we need to pay, too many people pay selective attention to research. I can give examples, but we don't have time. Too many people pay attention to selective research. Now, Jim mentioned some of that when he said that people don't pay attention to the literacy socialization research and the impact of that on literacy development. They just focus on foundational skills. People will go the opposite way and say, phonics is no better than contextualized literacy, when there are 536 studies that have been done on phonics, and the bulk of them show a moderate positive effect of phonics instruction. So moderate positive doesn't mean it's all that matters, but it matters. And if you only look at one study or only one review of the research, you're going to have a distorted view. So you got to be comprehensive in looking at research if we're going to use research. The other thing having to do, I worry about misrepresentation of research. And there are lots of examples of that, which I'm not going to get into because there's no time. But I think we have to have the integrity and the fortitude to hold ourselves and our colleagues accountable for citing research accurately. You can disagree with it. You can say it doesn't speak to my people. You can say the design is poor, but don't distort it. Don't say it claims something when in fact it doesn't. And so I worry about both of these going forward. And if we're ever going to kind of clarify the landscape and use research, which I think we all would advocate, we got to stop being selective about citing research, and we got to stop distorting the findings of research.
Thank you. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. So I think some of you have some resources that you want to share with our audience that you might want to speak to that might be helpful as people are thinking about dosage, design, implementation, and any last thoughts that you have as well for our audience. I'll start with you, Jim.
Okay, thank you. I totally agree with what Claude said. We need to get ideological considerations out of the mix when we look at the research. And unfortunately, I think ideological considerations are still there. There's a huge contrast. If you look at, for example, the special issues of Reading Research Quarterly that were published in 2021, where there was a large number of articles written by very credible researchers in the field that show a large amount of agreement across the scientific community. And that's very different from the kind of us versus them orientation that comes up in a lot of journalistic articles. And so I think it's worthwhile reflecting back on the disaster that was Reading First, where $6 billion was poured into helping low-income students learn to read and produced no impact on either reading engagement or reading comprehension. And the kind of criteria that were implemented as part of Reading First was banning classroom libraries. Any program that had classroom libraries was deemed as being non-scientific. We need to get away from that kind of nonsense. And so I think it's worthwhile looking at what is being implemented in our schools and making sure that it is consistent with both sides of the coin. The research showing the importance of foundational skills and the research showing the importance of literacy socialization. They're both needed.
Thank you, Jim. Martha, I'll go to you next.
I just want to kind of put in a plug for English language development at this time, and we're talking about ELD, which focuses on how English works and, provides exposure and practices with the aspects of English that come naturally to native English speaking students. And, of course, language and literacy and language development must be integrated with content throughout the day. And, we here in California call that integrated ELD. But ELD is, not just about understanding vocabulary, and also, what we see in the field and what happens is that all of a sudden it has more of a reading focus instead of a focus on how language works. And so, and just also that in the field, we do see that, a large amounts of the literacy block are devoted to phonics. And this is not the intention of, the science of reading, but that's what's happening in implementation. And so that's why I just feel that it's so important that we ensure that there is a comprehensive, multidimensional approach to literacy right from the beginning, and that we also, need to be aware of the impact of the science of reading on biliteracy programs and dual language immersion programs, especially programs that are 90-10. It's kind of crowding out, targeting the home language, and it's unintentional, but it is happening in the field. So thank you.
Thank you. And Claude, I'll give you the last word of any last thoughts that you have.
Well, I just want to get back to Jim invoked that another lightning rod of a word, balanced literacy. And I think he invoked it appropriately, because the National Reading Panel actually talked about balanced literacy. Now, not the balanced literacy that most people think. When most people hear the term balanced literacy, they think, not to cast aspersions, but units of study and multiple cueing and 3-cueing and so forth. That's not the balanced literacy that the National Reading Panel talked about. They talked about the kind of balanced literacy that I think Martha and Jim are referring to, which is you work on foundational skills, because we know those foundational skills are essential to getting a traction in reading. But at another part of the day, not at the same time, not simultaneously, not with mini lessons, you read quality literature. You do read aloud. You talk about and read and share things that'll build language, it'll build comprehension, it'll build background knowledge. But you don't mush them together, because they each need their attention. They need their magical, special qualities and abilities to promote literacy. You need the foundational skills to really cement the sounds and the symbols of the literate written language. But you also need oral experiences to build that language, to build that comprehension. So then when those roads converge, or if you like the rope metaphor, when the rope converges, you've got both sides. But you need dedicated times of foundational skills to build that foundation. And then at other times of the day, you want to build the language, the comprehension, the background knowledge. But don't mush them together. Don't think about 3-cueing where you're doing a bunch of stuff randomly at the same time. That is the wrong idea of balance. And I just want to lift up the notion of balance that I think Jim and Martha are talking about.
Well, thank you to the three of you. This was an excellent discussion. I think we could have talked all day. I will send out your resources that you offered up to our audience, so we'll get straight to that. But I do want to turn it back over to our hosts and just thank the three of you again for this wonderful discussion.